Hey guys, it's Dreamforce here. You know they say that every time you pick Hanzo in ranked, God kills a Kirin? Well, this is Thorin's channel. And every time you pick Hanzo in ranked, Thorin kills a seagull.
Right, this is going to be episode 13 of Watch the Overture. Me and Yiska back as usual. We continue on our trend. Like, to be fair, we actually probably should do more two-man episodes. We just got locked into that thing of like, because we've been making the episodes around the guest and their topic, it means just logically in your brain, you have to have a guest if you couldn't take that approach. But we can actually, believe it or not, viewers, talk about things ourselves. We just haven't done it, so maybe we'll be less lazy this year. But we do have a guest for this episode, and indeed we have built the topic list around him. And the guest is BEARHANDS, who is what is your title? Assistant coach for Florida Mayhem?
My title is Assistant General Manager / Head Scout of Florida Mayhem.
Right, okay. And what actually prompted this episode? So the topic is one I'm sure people are interested to discuss anyway. It's about Contenders, like where does it sit within the ecosystem of the Overwatch League, of Overwatch generally? Like what is it? Is it a path to pro? How do the teams view it, etc.? And a lot of this was sparked because I feel like it's worth referencing this directly because people will see why we were interested in the topic, was when you were commenting at the end of last year on Twitter about a player and saying like, oh, he's not bad, this player. You then said, because he said, oh, sorry, I didn't win the game for you, basically. He said, like, you said something, well, I'll just quote the end of it, which is you said that Contenders isn't really about winning. Like, that's not the most important thing in Contenders, which is quite a provocative statement, you know? People might think to themselves, like, if you're in Contenders, you know, the team that wins is the team that their players are probably going to get scouted, or maybe the whole team's going to get taken to an expansion slot. These are some things people were thinking last year, when the system launched. So can you give us, like, the opening gambit here? What was the thinking behind that statement?
Sure. So I think, like you say, you know, there are teams out there that have different mindsets. Like some teams are super focused on winning Contenders. For me and the teams that I've been with, and definitely the outlook of Florida Mayhem, is that the goal for both the players and the org should be for those players to improve and to become at a level where they're ready to play in Overwatch League. Like if you look at it just from a straight monetary point of view, the prize pool of Contenders is relatively low. And the monetary gains that you can get from buying out even one player from your academy team to an Overwatch League team, like that buyout could easily exceed the prize pool for winning a whole season. So from a monetary point of view, like it's just not set up in a way that makes the competition itself and like winning the tournament the most important part. And to add on to that, I think from a player's perspective, like the players' goals, every player that plays in Contenders, their goal is to play in Overwatch League. So sure. I think they're, as an org, our responsibility to them is to kind of do what we can to put them in the best position to accomplish those. And it just so happens that the way that Contenders is structured has allowed teams and organizations to sort of have alignment on those goals in terms of getting those players into Overwatch League.
Okay. Right. Is there something about this, Yiska, that surprised you when you saw this comment? Like, did you actually expect, whether or not teams really believe it or not, for people to, at least in terms of public-facing tweets and comments, to like sort of toe the line of like, right, no, Contenders is its own competition, you know, people have got to try and win it, you know, this is like a second league, obviously is how it was originally presented, as opposed to just, you know, farming league or somewhere that you look for just individual talents. Was this a surprise to you?
I mean, initially, yes. When I saw this tweet, especially when I interact, especially with non-signed, non-academy teams, I think their drive to win is just that driving focus that almost keeps that, because there are no contracts in place. The one unifying goal for them is to win it, right? And to be fair, if we look at the unsigned teams now, it is different from region to region. We have to say that, right? So, for instance, in Korea, those teams are much more professionalized than they are in, for instance, NA or EU. But for instance, let's take an NA org in this case, like LNL, last night's leftovers last time. I think they try to do their best, and just empirically, I have to say, it did surprise me that there was an expectation, and it was also reasonably argued to, made the argument to me that the approach that Mayhem takes here is feasible. It just in my mind, if I went through it empirically, so if I look at who won Contenders in all these regions, most of the time these teams get like 2 players at least sold, maybe 3 here and there. And I think generally winning Contenders nets you a little bit more of a buyout or chance than other cases.
I think there's absolutely something to that. Winning Contenders does make you more attractive to potential Overwatch League teams. And frankly, I think that's the number one reason to win Contenders. Like, I think that's, if you're going to make an argument that winning Contenders is important, I think that's the point that you rally behind right there. Mm-hmm. It just makes you more attractive to Overwatch League scouts. They're basically guys that have my job, but from other teams. Okay. And from my perspective, when I'm scouting players, personally, it has like, I don't factor whether their team is winning or losing. And like, this is kind of the exact reason why. Like, I try and look for more measurable, like mechanics and positioning and things that are kind of measurable, and metrics that you can sort of measure against other players in a way that wins and losses you can't really.
Even though when the first season of Overwatch League came along and we had Contenders launch, you could make the case that since people knew there would be expansion slots and, maybe if a team looked amazing in a region, Korea being an obvious example, the whole team might get picked up. And so in that particular sense, there's a very unique reason why that might have been treated as if it was a real second league. You couldn't truly be promoted, but you could sort of in a way, right? Putting that aside, because that was obviously a very unique scenario, which, unless there's more expansion slots, won't apply in the future Contenders. So my question would be this. If you look at what I would call like a comparable scenario, might be where in North America you have the collegiate system and people pick players up obviously for the drafts of the traditional sports leagues. They look at them in these particular divisions, etc. And actually typically they do tend to rate people based on if they went to the best school or if their school was the NCAA champion or whatever it might be. These are very good ways to be a marker. So what is it different about Overwatch at the moment, or the state of the scene, that means like, if a team wins, that's not necessarily as important as if, say, you played amazingly on, who knows, a quarterfinal team or something? Is there something unique about the current situation in Overwatch?
Yeah, I think there is. Like, especially when you compare it to like traditional sports like college football or something, you're talking about like players that go to Alabama are more likely to be recruited into the NFL by virtue of the fact that they went to Alabama. And my response to that would be that, like, first, getting onto the team at a school like Alabama, those guys recruit, super heavily in a way that Contenders teams just don't. Like, they just don't have the bandwidth to do that. And like, our scene is just not developed enough. Like a university like that has a scouting staff of, 40 people. There's not a Contenders team that has a total staff anywhere near that. Right. So, like, I think some of it is just bandwidth and like the fact that the collegiate traditional sports scene has had close to 100 years to develop and get their infrastructure in place. With Contenders, I would relate it a little more to like the NBA's D League or G League, where I think even a hardcore NBA fan couldn't tell me who won the D League championship last year.
Yeah, that's very fair, yeah.
But there are a lot of players playing in the D League right now that you will see in the NBA over the next 5 years.
Okay. Right. Do you take that concept further, for example, with the Florida Mayhem? Like, if this is really the case and it's about like developing players or just seeing how good a player is outside of the context of the Overwatch League, seeing where they really stack up, does that mean, for example, if you have a Contenders team, that it might not even be right to structure the Contenders team to make winning the goal? Like, if you had to put a player in a specific position or limit him somewhere. Like, I'll give you an example. I remember when I was very young, first going to those school trials for like different sports, and as a youngster, obviously I didn't understand even the premise. I thought, like, for example, so in my country, soccer, football is the main sport. Everyone who went to those trials when they were a kid naively thought the guy who scored the most goals is obviously going to get on the team, right? He's just scored all the goals. And so what would happen, and this is a very famous thing in like high school level coaching, is they took a whole bunch of the guys who were strikers in football and they put them as like a winger, or they put this guy as like a midfielder, and they told him something specific, like, in this game, try and control the midfield, or, keep this other way. And what these guys obviously didn't understand was, this was actually a way to see what their skill set was, see what they were capable of doing, but it's very different from if you'd have built the team to win, you'd put that guy as a striker and you'd try and just hope he scores goals. So is the philosophy is all encompassing in that sense? Does the team still exist in its own little bubble and try and win if it's a Contenders team? What do you think?
I can speak. I can't give you an opinion on just Contenders globally, right? But I can speak a little bit to Florida Mayhem, and I think if you look at the early stages of the most recent season of Contenders, our academy team was not playing goats, right? And I think if we had been going out there and just trying to win every game at all costs, we probably would have played a lot more goats early on. But I think we had the philosophy that we would rather our players sort of demonstrate their hero pools and show their actual skill sets in a way that is more conducive to them being picked up in a meta that's not good, right? Like, it's just really hard to scout talent when DPS players are playing Zarya time. So in retrospect, I think maybe we would have done a little better by our players if we had won some more of the matches that we, on paper probably should have won. I think that looking back at it with the benefit of hindsight, I think that might have put them in a better position in terms of being scouted by other teams. And that's a conversation that we've had in Florida Mayhem. And I think moving forward, we'll probably play it a little more traditionally. But I still think our goal is to make all of the players on Mayhem Academy as interesting as possible to any prospective team.
Okay. What do you think about this, Yiska? Because obviously the angle that I was alluding to that's interesting is, if you're a player hearing this, how does it change the way you think of your own play in the league? Like, what's your goals? What are you thinking of? What do you think on this topic?
Well, nowadays it's almost like the player has to be the complete package. It's not just the level of play and potential level of play down the road when the meta changes, and that is obviously always a big problem for a lot of these players. But last season we had this Tracer players, but it's also, having the social media and everything. I think it might be very confusing at this point, because from my point of view, and earlier, now it's not as much anymore, but at the start of last season, I was obviously very much into statistics and was looking at these types of things, and myself tried to dabble in trying to find these diamonds in the rough, so to speak.
Sure.
And the problem I see is with the level of scouting we currently have is that I wonder if we're sophisticated enough in those scouting methods that we can find a better metric or better metrics than winning. Because winning does one thing. It does incorporate all of those intangibles are in there. Even if you have never talked to the player, winning is the one stat that is sort of fine. It isn't the one thing where it is.
Someone has to be good if they win. Like, we can't obviously differentiating who it is might be tough, but someone must be good on the team if they want.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
I understand where you guys are coming from. It's just really hard for me to sort of buy into that mindset, specifically with GOATS meta, right? Like, say I'm scouting for a DPS player that I want to add another DPS player to my Overwatch League roster. How am I supposed to find that player when all the DPS players are playing Zarya? Like, can I use the metric of, they won, this DPS player won, but he's playing Zarya, so his hero pool, I have no idea. I'm just basing it on the metric that they won.
It's very in this example then, just for the specific example, since you give that, in that case, would it have literally been better for the DPS player who wants to, he can't know, obviously, the Florida Mayhem's thinking about
to play fair and lose?
Yeah, if he played, exactly, played something that was within the wheelhouse of what you might want.
In terms of my ability to scout that player, I would prefer to see him play Pharah and lose than to play Zarya and win. Absolutely.
Okay. In line with what Yiska was saying then, can you give us basically just your thoughts on how you scout a player? Does statistics come into it? Do you use that to initially look for people? Is the eye test king? What are you thinking of in this sense?
I wouldn't say that it's king. I think all of those things factor in different amounts depending on the situation and the player that you're scouting, right? Like, if I'm looking at a player that has played 3 seasons of Contenders Korea, then I'm mostly going to base it on his historical performances and metrics that I've gained from that. Whereas if I'm looking at a player that has played, 4 games of Contenders, just the ratio of how I weigh each of those things is just going to be a little different.
Yeah. I got to say one thing about the Mayhem approach I really like is that you guys seem to put, but by the same logic, you guys must think that the actual performance that people have in those games is much more important, or very, very important, when evaluating a player in comparison to just trying them out. Because that is a beef I always had with scouts who told me like, oh, he was so good in tryouts and everything like that. And it has to happen in the real games, right?
Oh, I totally agree with you. And I think, I'm recently joined Mayhem here. I've been with the team for a few months. And I think since joining, that's one of the points that I have been the loudest about, is that, we can't be basing this stuff off of trials. If anytime a team has a trial, in my opinion, things like mechanics and their positioning and their ability to play the game, that stuff needs to be determined before you even invite a player to trials. Players that are participating in trials, in my opinion, it should be about communication and team. Like the things that you can't really scout without having access to team comms and the things that you don't really get from just watching matches and contenders, that should be your focus when trialing players. If you're looking at their mechanics during a trial, like I kind of think you've already failed, because if you're trying to evaluate whether their mechanics are up to snuff or not, that player should not have been invited, is my opinion.
Yeah. I recently made the comment to a friend who does some scouting, and basically said to him, all you need is a load of VODs of the player and like one dinner where you find out what kind of a guy he is so he fits in.
I would call that a little cursory, but I'm assuming that he's being kind of hyperbolic, and
sure.
I tend to agree with that philosophy.
Yeah, it's a pithy way to say it. At least I'm sure it takes more than just one dinner, But I get the premise. Sure. All right, then, in that case, then, at least from your perspective, how does talent development actually factor into Contenders then? Because it sounds at the moment, I mean, obviously it hasn't been running for very long, admittedly. At the moment, it doesn't sound as much like you're looking for someone that's like, right, did they develop over the season? Have they become the sort of player? It's more like, are they just already the player with the skill set I like, and they have the attitude that we could work with? Is there development that can happen in Contenders in a sense?
No, I think there definitely is player development that can happen and does happen in Contenders. And there are times where we look for players specifically like that. Like in a lot of cases, especially the first example that comes to mind are players that are under 18. Right? Like players that just aren't eligible for Overwatch League. Your goal with those players is absolutely to develop them as players, or to maintain their ability, right? Like I've worked with players in the past that their time in Contenders was less about trying to develop them, despite the fact that they were ineligible for Overwatch League. Their time in Contenders was less about developing their skill set and more about specifically preventing further injuries and aggravating sort of past issues. So it's not necessarily about development. It could be about maintenance. I think it just comes down to the specific player that you're talking about.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, that is something that is so wildly different to regular sports, I think, is because we have that artificial line of the being eligible or not. But at the same time, basically no regular sports has their best players in the world under 18 most of the time, right? So
yeah, I mean, I think that's true.
Sure. At least not to the extent that esports does, where you could be 15 and be amazing. Yeah. Sure.
Like, I think the closest parallel you could make is with the NBA, right? Like they have the one and done rule where you have to play 1 year of college. And if you look at somebody like LeBron James, like there are players that absolutely could have entered the league without having played that 1 year, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Yeah.
But it's just like now there's that almost artificially elevates the level of Contenders consistently, and which makes it also a little bit sad that the viewership is so low, because for instance last season, now we have all these monsters coming in that now come of age, right? The runaway guys come to mind, for instance. I think Decay might have been one of them, that like all these players that now are of age, and also that provides an opportunity to Contenders also for other talent that might already be of age but is playing against legitimately top 10%, even among pro players, on their specific roles, right?
Right. Yeah, and I think there is some of that happens on the Contenders level. I think it's unfortunate that viewership is what it is, but I think as the scene develops and people get more interested in sort of seeing the rising stars of the scene, I think that's where the interest in Contenders really lies.
Do you think then that, like, again, this is obviously a lot of this is personal opinion. We're not mandating what the scene should do. For the Florida Mayhem, then, is the logic when you use the academy team more in line with the idea of like, let's be hands-on with some of these players so that we can actually it's sort of like trialing them before you trial them for the real team. Let's have the real coaching staff come and check out what they're like, and so you can get a sense of them before they might become a player, as opposed to just, like I implied before, if it had really been a second league, you might treat it as a second team and try and just win the league with it, and then it'd be indirectly there might be crossover.
Yeah, no, I think our goal at least is to treat Mayhem Academy more like a sister team to Florida Mayhem.
Right.
And I think that ideally there are a lot of parallels that you can draw and sort of benefits that you can get that are kind of ancillary. I think scrimming between the Overwatch League team and the Academy team has a lot of sort of inherent advantages. You can protect your strategies and things like that. And I know that our coaches our Overwatch League coaches work with our Academy players occasionally. It's not a huge percentage of their time, but there is some overlap there. So when you talk about the idea of moving players from Mayhem Academy to Mayhem, and I think you saw that with Apply, that's definitely part of our goal, sure. But I think in general, just making those players ready for any Overwatch League team is more of the focus, because we just would rather not limit their opportunities, right? If they have one shot to make it onto the roster of Florida Mayhem, and there are 19 other rosters out there that they have a chance of being.
Yeah, okay. I mean, that in itself is a very interesting topic to me, because really only, I guess predominantly, the New York Excelsior had their team as sort of like a incubator for their talent to then promote them later on. And yes, there is an inherent thing because of the age thing with Nene and Flower there. Yeah. But at the same time, it's it is very interesting to me that so few players were promoted from the respective academy teams to the main roster, and there was much more trading going on.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's super surprising, just given the way and the sort of the timeline of how Overwatch League teams were built and then Contenders teams were built sort of after the fact, for the most part, when it comes to academy teams. So I guess my perspective on that is just not to speak for New York Excelsior, although I do have some history there. Mm-hmm. I think we built the NYXL roster, and then there was a point where we were what's going to happen with Flower? And to a degree, XL2 was constructed to give Flower a team to play on. Mm-hmm. And I think we were kind of opportunistic when building that team and got some other talent that was pretty top tier. And some of those guys are still on XL2, and like you say, Nene has moved up. So I think the idea that getting back to this idea of players being promoted to their own Overwatch League teams versus being traded to other teams, I think some of it is by virtue of the fact that the pieces of those rosters just didn't naturally fit together in a lot of cases because of the sort of timeline of how those teams were constructed. That makes sense?
Mm-hmm. Okay. I've got a question then, using the example actually of Flower on the NYXL team then. So this is cause I think this frames what we set up as the initial premise. When someone like Flower, who admittedly was almost certainly going to be the Overwatch League anyway, just because of all the things in his past in the Apex and obviously the incredible talent level he has. But if you actually look at his time in Contenders, a lot of people were quite underwhelmed. If anything, his play there made some people think maybe he's overhyped. But to be fair, I often said to people, he is playing for, again, a mixed nationality team. And it's not like it's an Overwatch League team where they're necessarily as hands-on coached and the same lineup players all the time. So I can imagine if you're a Korean, that might make it even more challenging to try and showcase your skills in kind of like a halfway house scenario where you're not going to be in this team for a long time, but you're trying to still show you're good. Would he have been more suited if he'd have stayed in the Korean contenders and played there? Would that have helped out? What do you think on this topic?
Been more suited. I mean, I think again, it depends on what your goals are with Contenders, right? Would he have won more games in Contenders if he had played on a team in Contenders Korea? I don't know. Who cares, right? Like, that's not, at the time when I was with XL2, like, that was not our goal at all. Our goal was to prevent further injury to Flower and to have him get some practice time.
Okay.
And to maintain his skill level. Like, we had no interest in, like, exerting him or making him stress out or raise any of those levels of like, it was so far away from our goal. And like, I've seen all of these comments about how people think Flower underperformed in Contenders too, and like, I don't know, like, I would, if I were you, okay, I would take all of that with a grain of salt.
Okay, so you don't have to disclose this information. He did have surgery, I believe, during the Contenders season. So really, like, are you telling your player to play 100% if you don't necessarily need to? You have Magachu as a backup there. It's not like you're hurting for a player. So,
right.
I think
again, like, our goal was not necessarily to win, right? So doing further damage to a player, any player that has some kind of injury, further aggravating that in a scene like Contenders, if you know for sure that player is going to be playing on your Overwatch League team in the next season, like, that just doesn't make any sense. Like, why would you stress that player? Why would you potentially aggravate a pre-existing injury to go out of your way to try and win a tournament that just doesn't matter?
If someone is coming from the philosophy, the perspective that you've outlined so far in this episode, what do you think then of the way that the Contenders is run in terms of its timing of, like, running at the same time as Overwatch League or running in the off season of Overwatch League? Like, for someone from your background, wouldn't it be better if it was not at the same time as the Overwatch League, so the same staff could, devote more time to that, and you could kind of be more holistic in the approach? If the Overwatch League's running, it's going to limit to some degree what the actual main staff of an Overwatch League team could do. What do you think?
I honestly don't think it matters, because if Contenders were running during the off season, our Overwatch League coaching staff is not gonna then, like, dedicate more time to Contenders. Like, you're just changing the layout, right? Like, when those guys have free time is not dictated by the Contenders schedule, right? So changing when that free time is available is not going to free up any more time for our coaches. Like, if it happens during the off season, like, it's not like we just take the off season off and, like, everybody goes to Disneyland and hangs out. Like, everybody works. Like, it's not unique to Florida Mayhem. Like, every Overwatch League team is working during the off season. So it's not like the coaching staff could just then dedicate all of that time to Contenders. I think the question of whether it happens during the season or not is more related to marketing. And I don't have an answer for that.
I mean, one thing that one could consider here is that it would possibly be interesting if the playoffs of all these regions were already done, and we could have more of an idea of what is left in this pool. So there could be additional signings here that teams could do. I don't think it was ever disclosed if the signing window is actually closed right now or when it closes or whatever. But like, even if there was an open window right now, there's still something to be said about budgeting and about first things first and whatever. It's hard to, from the outside, to estimate how big of a chance now these players that are currently playing in the playoffs, especially in Korea, for instance, how big of a chance they have. And then hopefully, and also one has to say, scouts are only humans. There is some recency bias always in this. And I wonder if it would be better for Contenders players if their playoffs happened closer to signing windows being open, for instance, for a mid-season signing window.
Yeah, that's entirely possible. I could definitely see that as having a positive impact for players and their ability to make it onto Overwatch League rosters. But I also think that regardless of where, like, it's cyclical, right? Like, there's seasons ending and starting. So there's always going to be some kind of a gap, and that playoffs are always going to fall, either before or during or after a signing window. yeah, I think alignment could improve it from where we are now, but I also don't think that it's ever going to like line up exactly the way that you're describing.
Is it any kind of a concern from an org side of things that the viewership, the general interest in Contenders as its own thing, as like a product in itself, doesn't seem to be that high? Is that a problem? Is it a concern?
It's not a big concern for me. I don't have a lot of insight into like the sort of marketing and promotional side of the org. Like that's just not something that I'm super involved in. So would our team sponsors like the viewership and Contenders to be higher? I mean, probably. I don't have a great answer to that. I haven't had that conversation.
What about having some component that's like the LAN component? So either the finals or all online, maybe more teams make it, or maybe even, I even thought an interesting angle to take would be to give something to kind of compete for if you're a player. Maybe have some sort of an international tournament where, the top 4 from the Korean one comes to Blizzard, top 4 from the NA, from is this, obviously it sounds like a loaded question because it's like saying, would you like a free extra LAN? But would it actually offer any significant value beyond just being something cool? What do you think?
Yeah, of course. I think it would be of huge value. I think part of the problem with Contenders right now is that players in Contenders Korea have a huge advantage in terms of being signed to an Overwatch League roster because of the massive advantage they have in LAN experience. And I think until every other region is on that same plane, we're not going to see equivalent recruiting from each region. But I also think that what you're describing is kind of pie in the sky. I think what's a lot more likely is that every region of Contenders will be played online as opposed to every region of Contenders played online.
Yeah. Yeah, that's sadly...
you got it the wrong way around there. Eventually they'll be played on LAN, yeah?
I mean, I would hope. I don't have any insight there, but
that would be the ideal scenario.
I think, it would absolutely be the ideal scenario. I think the ideal scenario is every competitive match of Overwatch ever is played on a LAN. Like,
yeah. I mean, okay, so if we're accumulating value, let's say for academy teams, right? And there are still Overwatch League teams that don't have academy teams. And interestingly, it's not the ones that, for instance, or in London Spitfire's case, they seem to say, okay, we derive a lot of value from the additional viewership, from the talent development and the money that comes in from there, even though that is probably always a net negative for basically every single academy team. I don't think any academy team has made money from selling players in comparison to their wages or their housing.
I don't think that's true. I think there are a couple that have made net profit from selling players.
Okay.
Globally. If you're talking about Contenders globally.
Yeah, okay. I mean, yes, okay. That like for Contenders globally, I think that is true. I'm not sure if it's true for academy teams, though. Then again, academy teams don't have to abide by this 100% rule, and that is quite interesting. But it's interesting to see that value is seen so differently. So if it's an accumulation of the value you get in terms of exposure, the money that comes in, the ability, and we haven't talked about this, but in essence, it's also a pretty good holding spot for contracts in the off season, or rather when the window is closed and nobody else wants to compete for that very contract. Then it's also, I think Mayhem is even a little bit advanced here, where you say you want your team to scrim with your main team and sort of have a second team there. I don't think, I mean, obviously this is not possible for London Spitfire in the current situation. What is, I guess, I don't want to put you on the spot in that regard, but the value seems to be more than monetary. And what could one get or advertise so others jump also on the academy team?
Like why should the teams, the Overwatch League teams that don't have an academy team, what extra value would they get? Like someone might say, for example, if they listen to this conversation, maybe better if you don't already have a team, so you didn't initially, outlay the money. Why not be cynical? Just snipe other people's players, figure out which the good ones are there, and don't, let them coach up a bunch of players. What would the value to having a team be, do you think?
I mean, frankly, I think that is a perfectly fine business model. Not having a Contenders team and just sniping players from other academy teams. If that's the way an org chooses to go, I think that's completely viable. For the teams that do choose to have an academy team, I would say that there are 3 real tent poles of where you can make that team worthwhile. The first is in selling your players to other teams, like the guy that doesn't run an academy team, right? The second is developing those players and putting them on your own Overwatch League team. And then the third is whatever kind of strategic value that you can get, whether that's from your staff and players of your Overwatch League team evaluating scrims or Contenders matches straight up of your Contenders players, or whether that's through scrimming your Overwatch League team versus your Academy team. Like whatever data and metrics and analysis you can draw out of that and then apply it to Overwatch League, I think that there is that amount is not zero, right?
Okay. Right. One thing, especially when I saw that this was like a feature of Contenders, it's the same scenario actually happens in League of Legends where they have an academy system, which is the idea also that if you have both teams, a top level team and an academy team, you can potentially move players between the two. Like you can actually have someone comes up for a few weeks and he tries to play in the main team, whatever, injury, or you just want to try him out. And then if it doesn't work out, you can also go the other way. And likewise, it means, if you have a pro who's on your Overwatch League team who's just never going to get any play, we could also use him, test him out in the Contenders team, or maybe help him develop other players. Right? This seems like something which in the future could be incredibly valuable, but doesn't get used that much at the moment. Now, admittedly, again, I'll give fair context, which is the first season of Overwatch League, again, wasn't exactly like this, where we're getting all these unknown talents coming out of the Contenders. It was more like you had the really good players generally were signed by the Overwatch League teams, and a lot of the players initially in Contenders, except for the ones who were age restricted, were just typically the second-rate players. They weren't going to be on the Overwatch League team. So I get that in the season one, it might not have been that great a feature, and it might not be employed as much. Does it have a lot of value right now? Do you think this is something that in season 2 of Overwatch League will be used more, or will be significant to people's, how the roster ships out?
I think it's something that we'll see used more in Contenders season 2, but I don't think that it's really. I don't think I've seen a team that is prepared to fully take advantage of the two-way rules in the way that you could to greatest effect. And so what I really mean by that, part of it is the region locking rules in Contenders, right? Like you're allowed to have 3 players on your roster that are from outside of the region. But the way that works is it's based on week to week, right? So you can have 3 players. You can basically change your whole roster in Contenders every week. So from week to week, those 3 players that are from outside of your region could really be from anywhere. And if those players are signed to your Overwatch League team on a 2-way, that kind of gives you the flexibility in having those players kind of locked up and still able to play them in either roster.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So let me ask this, because this is very interesting to me. Now we have this concept of the 2-way player, and they have special contracts, is my understanding, where upon a specific amount of games from this 2-way player in the Overwatch League, his contract transforms into a full pro contract. Is that right?
No, basically their contract is already like a fully pro Overwatch League contract. They're just specified how many games that they can play per stage in Overwatch League before they're ineligible to play in Contenders during that.
Right. So it's mainly just to protect from someone basically trying to have twice the roster size and just be able to insert an infinite amount of play. Okay, that makes more sense, right? Did you have a question along those lines, Yiska?
Yeah. Do you think a lot of these clauses will be triggered this season?
A lot? Probably not. I think there will be more than we saw in season 1, which was basically 0, right? Like, I don't think anyone made use of it in season 1. So I think we'll see it some. Like, I know that we'll see it some, but I wouldn't say a lot. Like, I think it'll still be something relatively unique.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do we have still some time left? Because there's one other prominent.
23 minutes to go.
Okay,
Just keep going.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So this is another prominent tweet you had, and I don't remember the word. No, not the second one specifically.
Okay.
Let's talk about the concept about these non-academy teams signing contracts with their players. And I think you went on record saying that this is something that, I mean, it's also would have been the case with LNL. There are, especially in Europe, there are a lot of European teams.
I think it's a huge mistake for both the player and the org to not have a contract with their players. I think let me back up a little bit, because I think when I say this kind of thing on Twitter, everybody freaks out, especially players, especially young players. They freak out at just the idea of a contract. And like, I'm not suggesting that you go out and sign a contract that like locks you into a team for a specific amount of time or has a specific amount of buyout. Like, none of that is related to what I'm talking about when I say have a contract. Like, I'm basically talking about an employment agreement between you and your team. Like, for example, let's say I have an Overwatch League Contenders team. Sorry, not an Overwatch League team. Say I have a Contenders team where I have 10 players, none of them have contracts, and we go undefeated and run the table and win the whole thing. What stops me from just running off with the prize pool? Like, players have no contractual protection that says that I'm going to distribute that prize pool to them. Like, what? How is that okay for players? Like, why would you not want to have a contract with your org that specifies all of that and lays out like what they owe you and vice versa?
Teams. I mean, again, Yiska specified these are teams that aren't the academy teams. You know, they are just Contenders teams. Are there a lot that have just players without contracts?
There are more than zero, which in my opinion is way too many. Like, it's bananas to me that there would be a single team that would.
Well, the thing is, I guess the question for me is from a team perspective, because it really is an org in many of those cases behind them. Where would that legal representation come from that allows
Come on, man. Go on Reddit and find, like, you can find someone that will do that for free. Like, I promise you there's a lawyer out there that's just waiting to find some way to get involved in esports.
Yeah, it's a very simple contract you probably get.
If you can't find someone to go out and do that, like, what are you doing running a team? Like, you know, like, there are responsibilities that you have to take care of, whether you're running an organization or a team, or it's just you and your friends sitting around playing Overwatch. Like, if you're playing at Contenders at that level, like, you have to take some responsibility. If you're trying to make this your career, make it your career. Like, let's get serious, right? Like, I don't know.
I mean, the least bit it takes is 6 players and a coach, pretty much, to be in a Contenders team. You don't necessarily need a coach, and the open division doesn't select for the ability to organize these things. So unless there is a minimum requirement from the league, it's hard for me to...
I agree with you. There's not a requirement from the league. And I hear what you're saying. But can you not just take those 6 players and their one coach and have everybody write down on a napkin, like, if we win, I get $1,000? Because that's a contract.
Sure.
And like, if you don't have that basic level of anything, like, it's real hard for me to have any sympathy when your coach inevitably runs off with all of your gear and everything. You know, like.
To be fair, I went a couple of years into law school in Germany, and it's significantly harder for a German to sign a contract like that. It's much more.
I believe you, but again, like, there are resources that you can make use of here, right? Like, there's Reddit. There are people out there that are willing to help you. Just make use of it. Take advantage of that.
Yeah.
Does Contenders actually serve as like a prerequisite for players going forwards in the Overwatch League? Like, for example, will there still be players next signing window who are just coming out of solo queue or other third-party competitions that have a chance to get signed? Do you think it's going to become necessary that you have some Contenders resume?
I think the vast majority of players that make it to Overwatch League will have come from Contenders, but not 100% by any means.
I think the second part of the tweet, I agree with the general notion that we need to professionalize Contenders and just give. I mean, a lot of what happened last week could have been avoided in both instances, I think, even though I'm not sure if that person wouldn't have signed a contract under a fake name. Sure. Not putting it past him.
regardless, there would have been some level of protection there, right?
Yeah. What the initial tweet, I think, was also about those teams making money off that. And from the...
Which is entirely feasible. And for in the example of Second Wind, which I feel like is the team that when I made that tweet, I was not intending to call out Second Wind. It has kind of turned into that. So I'm going to use them as an example in this, and maybe I shouldn't. But if you were Second Wind, how is your responsibility not to ensuring the longevity of your team so as to further benefit future players? Right? Let's say tomorrow, every player from Second Wind got picked up by an Overwatch League team. And then the owner of Second Wind decided, like, yes, I still want Second Wind to be a thing moving forward. So we're going to go pick up more players. Like, do you not then have a responsibility to create an infrastructure that allows for your players to not just be randomly screwed over by any number of things that could happen, which sort of necessitates contractual agreements with those players?
I think I do agree with that. I think the monetizing part is pretty hard. Also, in Second Wind's case, I think that organization has been even around for a little bit longer. I'm not sure if the initial Second Wind, which was then picked up by EG way before Overwatch League, if that is the same people. If not, okay, whatever, then they just remained with the name. But yeah, if you want to be around, and I mean, then again, for most of these guys, their goal is not to have that organization, but to be picked up for a management position, like it worked for Kate Mitchell, for instance, or
sure,
you know.
So if your goal is to get a position with an Overwatch League team, like, I can definitely tell you that your experience and your resume is going to look a hell of a lot better the more things that you've been able to do to professionalize that organization and that, right? And like the sort of baseline of that is employment agreement.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you're shooting yourself in the foot if your goal is to get a position with an Overwatch League team, and then you're not doing everything you can to make yourself ready for that position.
What about then, since obviously the very premise of Contenders is always going to be tied up with the idea of, like, these could be the talents you see in the Overwatch League one day. That's part of kind of the concept of why people should want teams, why people should want to watch it. It's the best way to sell the league. As you alluded to before, obviously, because the Korean Contenders basically is just Apex with the players that are left, and they have that rich history, and everyone's been playing on LAN from day one, and they're all vetted, etc. Right? Even if they weren't Koreans, and Koreans happen to be very good at Overwatch League when you get to the top level, they'd already have some advantages. But then you have to add in, obviously, people saw what I called the Korean creep, where as Overwatch League Season 1 went on, more and more Koreans came into teams, joining teams, even Academy, you know. As he said, that's the reason why the region locking exists. So in that sense, talent development as a moniker becomes very different now for some of the Western contender regions, because now people would say, okay, you're going to get the best Koreans are going to come over every season anyway. They're going to be picked up. But how do we develop non-Korean talents? Like, what do you think on the angle of having the region locking angle? Because, you know, some people are still going to use that as like, right, well, I'll pick the 3 best Koreans I can get into my team, and then I'll have the rest be, you know, North Americans, Europeans. What do you think on this angle? Because obviously getting players who aren't Korean is going to become a challenge, its own task, right?
Not necessarily, right? Because if you go back to the 3 goals that I was describing of a Contenders team, right? One is to sell those players to other teams. And I think that there are a lot of Overwatch League teams out there that specifically do not want to recruit Korean players because they want players that are representative of their local fan bases, let's say.
Sure.
So I think that there is a huge market in the Overwatch League for non-Korean players, especially for American players. So I think developing those players as an academy team still accomplishes one of your.
Yeah, the problem is that a lot of these teams now, and that is also a problem I have with the signing bonus, especially in these edge case situations where someone is towards the bottom 10% of ability, let's say, in Overwatch League, and is currently still on a Contenders team. I think not having a signing bonus is such a huge deal. We're talking about situations where the best business people in esports are struggling to even squeeze 50% out of their players, right? Like in terms of 50%, meaning their final salary, and then what the signing bonus would be. So in terms of signing bonus or like having a buyout for these teams, especially non-academy teams that don't have that business acumen, I think there's no way you're getting your players into teams like DC or like Boston if you have a buyout. I think it's a huge competitive disadvantage unless it is mandated by contenders.
And it's not. There's no mandated buyouts. And I tend to agree. There are teams out there that will look at two players and be like, these players are of relatively similar skill level. Player A has a buyout, player B does not. That's the decision, right? And they base their decision on that. First, I would say I think that's the minority of teams in the league. Second, I would say that I think that those teams are probably not going to have a lot of success in competitive Overwatch in the league. Like if that's how you're building your team, I just don't think you're going to win a lot of Overwatch League games.
What about this then? Again, obviously, when I paint with really broad strokes like this, like there's going to be many examples that would go for and against it. If you're a team who, as you say, doesn't have the notion of like, we'll just eventually just get all Koreans anyway, and Koreans are the best, and kind of that like simplistic view, it should be of more value to you to use the academy team or your contenders team to develop talents that aren't Korean. Yeah. So
absolutely.
Along these lines, do you think that enough teams do that? I mean, it looks to me like some teams might even go, again, if they're half and half, they might say, well, then maybe I just want to use my contenders team to see if that future Korean talent can actually hang in a team that's mixed national. There's a different angle you could take on it. So where do you go with that?
I mean, you're asking me to sort of describe the mentality of other Overwatch League teams, which is something that I have found very hard to do. Like, I think it's very, very hard to kind of get in the mindset of the other GMs across Overwatch League and sort of rationalize how they make their decisions. Like, I've tried to do that since the beginning with every roster move that has been made, and I think it leads to an aneurysm.
I mean, that is pretty much also the case for all the contenders teams trying to get their players signed, right? It's very hard to find that connection between, and there once again come these intangible factors that are outside of the game, where you have to sort of read the crowd in what kind of player you want to be. So let's say, okay, let's even then again try to sort of give a broad average stroke. What should a contenders player focus on when trying to appeal to Overwatch League teams? Should they try to do more in socials? Should they try to get their team to play more heroes? Or should they just hardcore try to win?
I think, in my opinion, having good socials is probably going to get you more value than winning matches. Based on the conversation that I've had with team owners across the league and other people in my position, there's just a huge amount of inherent value to just having big social and a huge reach on social. I really can't understate how important that stuff is. That having been said, I think your skill at playing Overwatch is undoubtedly the most important thing. And as much as you can do to demonstrate that, whether it's through playing a diverse hero pool or maximizing your efforts on one hero, like I think there are several viable strategies for contenders players to get into Overwatch League. And I think, it depends a little on the player as to how he's going to go about that. Like if there are players in Overwatch League like Libero, right, who can play any hero in the game. And if you can show your ability to do that in contenders, I think it'll go a long way. That having been said, I think there are also dudes in contenders that pretty specialize on one or two heroes. Like if you look at Mangachu, like I can't really name a lot of people that are better at Pharah than Mangachu, especially if you're talking about Western players. So if there's an Overwatch League team out there that is really trying to recruit a Western Pharah player, I think Mangachu's doing a lot of the right things to get on that roster.
It is very interesting that the trend, though, was, at least this offseason, that if we look at, I mean, yes, there's two types of two sides to the coin here. But if we see Seagull left the Overwatch League, XQC IDDQD, Mendo, these are the big personalities of Overwatch streaming, right? It's interesting that, with the exception, I guess, of the friend, this motion isn't coming that other way. And I think if socials were really very important, it's interesting to see for instance, some will happen with someone like, let's say, Kefri in the mid-season signings, even though realistically it's questionable if he would fill any of those performance holes. But then again, he meets the social criteria. There are wicked things you can do with a contract there.
I mean, to be fair, Kefri has looked pretty good in Contenders. Like, in the times that he's played, it has almost exclusively been Widowmaker. I'll grant you that. But, like, he did play some May. He looked pretty good on May. I'm just saying, like, I don't think that there's anyone out there that is going to recruit Kefri just based on socials. That having been said, like, I think that there could be a team out there that looks at his socials and is like, wow, this is really compelling. Let me take a closer look at his ability to play the game and, then not eliminate him from their player pool.
Right. If we get, this can be one of the sort of final topics as we start to close up. If we get a team and they've had a player who is good enough to compete at the Contenders level, maybe he even fits the particular Contenders team he's playing on, but he never gets signed by an Overwatch League team. Either there's no interest, or they try him and they say, like, okay, he's sort of like stuck in no man's land. He's good enough to be Contenders, but he's not good enough to be Overwatch League. And so he's kind of someone where if they kept him, he would just play in Contenders his career, a couple of years, couple of seasons, whatever it might be. If for a team in coming from your perspective, where it's more like about finding out if this is a good player, if it's a player who might be capable of being in the Overwatch League on our team, another team, wouldn't it be the case that once you figure out a player's kind of not going to make the leap, even if he could be a manageable piece in Contenders, it's better to just get someone who's a fresh talent, a fresh name, and start over again? What do you think?
Maybe. I think, again, like, you go back to the goals that your org has for your Contenders team. And for us, one of those goals is to be able to participate in scrims against Florida Mayhem. So if they're a player that is contributing value to making those scrims worthwhile for both the rest of the Academy team and, more importantly, the Overwatch League team, like, if they're providing values in those scrims, then I think that player probably still has a place on that roster, unless you're able to replace them with somebody that checks those same boxes and also has potential to go to Overwatch.
This video was kindly supported by Dean Tanglis, Andreas Snazore Westerlund, Gardner Wilson, OllieJ, Tobias Bernasconi, NateDOhDoubleG, James Harding, Kyla Harris, Travis Greb, Daniel Yordanov, Tristan Jones, and a special thanks goes out to Jerky's Minion. Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest for upcoming content of mine? Perhaps you'd like to ask me a question for my monthly video AMA. Do you want some teasers to see who the next guests are for my talk shows, for my interviews? Maybe you'd like to take part in a monthly esports discussion with yours truly. Well, put your money where your mouth is at the Patreon link in the description box below and join the Scrilluminati today.